10 years thrown away with a 2-line letter. He took not only her heart, but also every penny she had in the bank. Evelyn's world shattered the moment she found the letter, her trembling fingers barely able to hold the parchment that would destroy everything she believed about her life. The autumn morning had begun like countless others in the secluded village of Thornwick, where ancient stones whispered secrets and shadows danced longer than they should. But the words, "I cannot pretend anymore," written in Marcus's familiar script, transformed her cozy cottage into a prison of betrayal. 10 years of shared dreams, whispered promises beneath star-laden skies, and a love she thought unbreakable had been reduced to cold sentences on paper, each word a dagger twisting deeper into her chest. She had awakened alone, which wasn't unusual since Marcus often left before dawn to tend to his duties as the village's appointed keeper of old traditions. But the silence that greeted her felt different somehow, heavier with an ominous weight that made her skin prickle with unease. The cottage they had shared for a decade felt suddenly foreign, as if the very walls were conspiring against her, and when she stumbled into the kitchen seeking the comfort of morning tea, the letter waited on the worn wooden table like a harbinger of doom. Her hands shook so violently she could barely unfold the parchment, and as her eyes scanned the devastating words, the world tilted on its axis, sending her stumbling backward until her spine pressed against the cold stone wall. "The curse was never meant for both of us," the letter continued in Marcus's precise handwriting, each word carved into her memory with brutal clarity. "What I am, what we've become. It was a mistake that I must correct before it destroys us both. By the time you read this, I will be gone from Thornwick, from the shadow realm that binds our kind, and from your life forever. Do not try to find me, Evelyn. Some bonds are meant to be broken, no matter how much it tears our souls apart." The parchment fluttered to the floor as Evelyn's legs gave out, her body sliding down the wall until she sat crumpled on the cold stones, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of his betrayal. The curse he mentioned, the shadow realm, their kind, what did any of it mean? Throughout their years together, Marcus had always been secretive about his past, claiming his family's traditions were too complex for outsiders to understand. But she had never pressed him for details, trusting that love would eventually dissolve all barriers between them. Now she realized how naive she had been, how blind to the signs that something darker lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. The cottage that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum of broken promises, each room echoing with memories that had turned poisonous. The bedroom where they had shared countless nights of passionate embraces now mocked her with its emptiness. The sheets still bearing the faint scent of sandalwood and winter storms that always clung to Marcus's skin. The library where he had read to her from ancient texts she couldn't decipher felt like a repository of lies, every leather-bound volume now suspect in its contents. Even the garden where they had planted herbs under moonlight, where he had kissed her among the silver-leaf plants that seemed to glow with their own inner light, had been transformed into a reminder of her gullibility. 3 months passed in a haze of grief and growing terror as Evelyn discovered the true extent of Marcus's deception. The cottage, which she had believed they owned together, was mortgaged in her name alone. The papers bearing a signature she didn't remember making, but couldn't deny was hers. Their shared savings had vanished from the village bank, leaving her with barely enough coin to survive the approaching winter. Worse still, the other villagers began treating her differently, their once warm greetings replaced by nervous glances and hurried conversations that ceased when she approached. It was as if Marcus's departure had stripped away some invisible protection she hadn't known she possessed, leaving her exposed to scrutiny and suspicion. The first supernatural incident occurred on a fog-shrouded evening, when desperation drove her to search Marcus's private study for any clue about where he might have gone. Hidden behind a false panel she discovered by accident, she found a collection of journals written in his hand, their pages filled with references to bloodline curses, shadow creatures, and a prophecy that spoke of a woman whose power would either save or destroy the supernatural community of Thornwick. Her heart stopped when she realized the physical description matched her own perfectly. Auburn hair that caught fire in moonlight, eyes that shifted from green to silver depending on her emotions, and a birthmark on her left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon. As she read deeper into the journals, the truth of her heritage unfolded like a nightmare, gaining substance. Her family line carried the blood of ancient seers, women who could bridge the gap between the mortal realm and the shadow world where creatures of legend still thrived. The gifts had been dormant in her bloodline for generations, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken them, and Marcus had been sent to watch over her, to ensure that if her powers ever manifested, they would be controlled and contained. What neither of them had anticipated was falling genuinely in love, a complication that had apparently terrified his superiors enough to order their separation. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over as she struggled to breathe through the crushing weight of understanding. Every tender moment they had shared, every whispered declaration of love, every night he had held her close while she slept, had it all been an elaborate lie? The thought that her entire adult life had been built on deception was almost too much to bear, and she found herself sobbing into the ancient pages, her tears mixing with ink that seemed to shimmer and move in the candlelight. But grief soon transformed into something more dangerous as her suppressed heritage began to assert itself. Objects in the cottage started responding to her emotional state. Candles flickering when she felt angry, mirrors cracking when she cried, and the very stones of the walls growing warm when fear overwhelmed her. The changes were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination, but they grew stronger with each passing day, as if Marcus's departure had somehow unlocked restraints that had kept her true nature hidden. The villagers' behavior toward her grew increasingly strange as well. Old women would cross themselves when she passed, children would peek at her from behind their mothers' skirts, and the village priest began making pointed references to the dangers of unchecked power during his weekly sermons. She realized with growing horror that they all knew what she was becoming, had perhaps always known, and were watching to see whether she would follow the path of light or darkness that the prophecy foretold. It was during this period of isolation and self-discovery that she first encountered Darius Blackthorn, though she didn't know his name at the time. She had ventured into the whispering woods that bordered Thornwick, seeking solitude among the ancient oaks whose branches formed natural cathedrals of green and gold. The forest had always called to her, its shadows seeming to welcome her in ways she had never understood. But that evening the pull was almost irresistible, as if something vital to her survival waited among the trees. She was sitting beside the old stone circle that legend claimed was built by the first supernatural settlers of the region when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Her newly awakened senses picked up details that should have been impossible to detect. The confident stride of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous territory, the subtle scent of leather and storm clouds, and an underlying energy that made the very air around her vibrate with tension. When she turned to face the intruder, her breath caught in her throat at the sight of the most magnificent and terrifying man she had ever seen. Tall and imposing, with hair as black as a moonless night and eyes that seemed to hold the depths of eternity, he moved through the forest as if he owned every tree and stone. His clothing was simple but well made, practical garments that spoke of someone who valued function over fashion, yet he wore them with the natural elegance of nobility. When their gazes met across the small clearing, she felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the primal awareness that she was in the presence of a predator far more dangerous than any mortal man. "You're trespassing," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice when her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The words were foolish. The forest belonged to no one, least of all her, but something about his presence demanded a challenge, as if submission would be a betrayal of her newly emerging nature. Am I? His voice was like aged whiskey, smooth and warm with an underlying burn that promised both pleasure and pain. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, not cruel, but undeniably predatory, as if he found her defiance amusing rather than threatening. These woods have stood for 1,000 years, little seer. They've seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of magic itself. What makes you think any mortal claim could hold weight here? The casual way he called her little seer sent chills racing down her spine. Confirmation that her worst fears were true. Whatever she was becoming was obvious to those who knew how to look. She wanted to run, every instinct screaming at her to flee before this dangerous stranger could do whatever he had come here to accomplish. But her legs felt rooted to the earth, as if the ancient stones were holding her in place. There was something mesmerizing about him, a pull that went beyond physical attraction into something more primal and inevitable. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance that felt both natural and terrifying. I'm just a woman who lost her way in the forest. His laughter was rich and dark, rolling through the clearing like thunder across distant mountains. Just a woman, he repeated, taking a step closer that brought him to the edge of the stone circle. Is that what you tell yourself when the candles dance to your heartbeat? When the mirrors show you futures that haven't yet come to pass? When the very earth beneath your feet hums with recognition of what you carry in your blood? Each question hit like a physical blow, stripping away the last of her pretenses and leaving her exposed under his knowing gaze. How could he possibly know about the strange occurrences that had been plaguing her? Unless he was connected to the supernatural community that Marcus had hidden from her, the same community that had apparently been watching her all along, waiting to see what she would become. Who are you? She whispered, the question carrying more weight than she had intended. It wasn't just his name she wanted to know, but his purpose, his intentions, and why his presence filled her with equal measures of terror and inexplicable longing. Someone who has been waiting a very long time to meet you, Evelyn Ashworth, he replied, and the sound of her full name on his lips sent another shiver through her body. My name is Darius Blackthorne, and I am what your people would call an alpha, a king among wolves, a guardian of the old ways, and perhaps the only one who can help you understand what you're becoming before it destroys you. The revelation that he knew exactly who she was, combined with his casual mention of being a wolf shifter, should have sent her fleeing into the night. Instead, she found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the promise of answers she had been desperate to find. How do you know my name? How do you know what's happening to me? Because your bloodline is legendary among our kind, Darius said, his expression growing more serious as he studied her face in the fading light. The Ashworth Seers have been guardians of the balance between worlds for generations. Though the gift has been dormant so long, most believed it was lost forever. Your awakening has sent ripples through the supernatural community, little one. There are those who would see you trained and protected, and others who would prefer you destroyed before you can reach your full potential. The casual way he spoke of her potential destruction made her stomach clench with fear. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was not among those who wished her harm. Still, she had learned the hard way not to trust too easily, especially when it came to men who seemed to know more about her than she knew about herself. And which category do you fall into? She asked, proud of how steady her voice remained despite the turmoil in her chest. That remains to be seen, he replied with maddening ambiguity, but his eyes never left hers, and she could see something that might have been genuine concern flickering in their dark depths. Your keeper abandoned his post without warning, leaving you vulnerable and untrained. The council sent me to assess the situation and determine whether you can be trusted with the power that's awakening within you. The mention of Marcus as her keeper sent a fresh wave of pain and anger through her system, and she felt the temperature in the clearing drop several degrees in response to her emotional turmoil. Frost began forming on the grass around the stone circle, and the ancient oaks creaked ominously as their branches swayed despite the lack of wind. Darius's eyes widened slightly at the display of power, but he didn't step back or show any sign of fear. "He wasn't my keeper," she said through gritted teeth, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "He was supposed to be the man who loved me." "Perhaps he was both," Darius said quietly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Love and duty don't always align cleanly, especially not in our world. Marcus Thorne was given an impossible task: to watch over you without letting you discover your true nature, to protect you while keeping you weak. When your powers began manifesting despite his precautions, he faced a choice between his mission and his heart." "You speak as if you know him," Evelyn said, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Are you here to take me back to him? To drag me to this council that apparently thinks it has a claim on my life?" "I'm here to give you a choice that no one else will offer," Darius replied, taking another step closer to the edge of the stone circle. "You can come with me willingly to learn about your heritage and train your abilities, or you can remain here and wait for the less patient members of the council to arrive. I promise you, little seer, their methods will be far less gentle than mine." The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall, and Evelyn realized that her life had reached another crossroads. She could sense the truth in his words, could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows, waiting to see what choice she would make. But the thought of trusting another powerful man so soon after Marcus's betrayal made her stomach turn, even as her emerging instincts whispered that Darius might be her only hope for survival. "How do I know you're not just another keeper sent to control me?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her own voice, but needing to understand his true motivations before she made a decision that could determine the rest of her life. Darius was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of conviction that was impossible to fake. "Because I have no interest in controlling you, Evelyn Ashworth. What I want is to see what you become when you finally stop apologizing for your own existence." His words hit her like a physical force, stripping away layers of self-doubt and revealing truths she had been afraid to acknowledge. All her life she had been the accommodating one, the woman who put everyone else's needs before her own, who apologized for taking up space and asked permission to exist. Even with Marcus, she had shaped herself to fit his expectations, accepting his secrecy and distance because she was grateful to be loved at all. But standing in that ancient circle with power crackling through her veins and frost spreading at her feet, she began to glimpse who she might become if she stopped hiding from her own strength. The possibility was both terrifying and exhilarating, a glimpse of a future where she was no longer a victim of other people's choices, but the architect of her own destiny. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "what happens to my life here? To everything I've built in Thornwick?" "What life?" Darius asked with brutal honesty. "The cottage that was mortgaged in your name while you slept? The neighbors who cross themselves when you pass? The lover who abandoned you the moment your true nature began to show? There's nothing left for you here but shadows and regret." His words stung because they were true, but they also sparked something fierce and defiant in her chest. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she hadn't considered what she might gain by embracing the unknown. The woman who had awakened that morning to find her world shattered was not the same person who now stood in a circle of ancient stones, frost blooming at her feet and power singing in her veins. "When would we leave?" she asked, and saw something that might have been approval flicker in Darius's dark eyes. tonight, if you're brave enough," he replied. "The moon is dark, which will help mask our departure, and waiting only increases the danger to both of us. Pack light. Where we're going, you'll have little need for reminders of your mortal life." The finality in his voice should have terrified her, but instead it felt like liberation. She thought of the cottage full of broken dreams and the village where she had never truly belonged, and realized that leaving them behind might be the first honest thing she had done in years. But as she prepared to take the first step toward an uncertain future, she caught sight of movement in the shadows beyond the stone circle, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. They were no longer alone in the forest, and from the way Darius's entire body went rigid with alertness, she knew that whatever had found them in the darkness was not there to wish them well. The real test of her awakening powers was about to begin, but the question was whether she would face it as the frightened woman she had been, or embrace the dangerous creature she was becoming. The shadows moved with predatory grace, circling the stone circle like hunters who had finally cornered their prey, and Evelyn's newly awakened senses screamed warnings that made her blood sing with adrenaline. Darius shifted beside her, his casual demeanor vanishing as his body coiled with lethal tension, every muscle preparing for violence that felt inevitable in the thickening darkness. She could smell something wrong on the night air now, a metallic scent like old blood mixed with decay that made her stomach lurch with instinctive revulsion. "Stay behind me," Darius commanded, his voice dropping to a growl that resonated with inhuman undertones. And for the first time, she understood that whatever he was, it was far more dangerous than a simple wolf shifter. His eyes had begun to glow with an amber light that seemed to pierce the shadows, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of fangs that were definitely not human. "And whatever happens, don't let them touch you. Your blood carries power they would kill to possess." 3 figures emerged from the tree line, with movements too fluid to be entirely mortal, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. They wore robes that whispered against the forest floor, like secrets being shared between conspirators, and the very air around them seemed to grow colder with each step they took toward the ancient circle. When the leader pushed back his hood, revealing features that were beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers were beautiful, Evelyn felt her heart skip with recognition and terror. "Lucian Ashford," Darius said, his tone carrying centuries of animosity and warning. "I should have known the Shadow Court would send their most charming executioner to collect what they believe is theirs." The pale man's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, revealing teeth that gleamed like pearls in the darkness. His hair fell in silver waves to his shoulders, and his eyes were the color of winter storms, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Everything about him screamed predator, from the graceful way he moved to the casual cruelty that seemed to radiate from his very presence like heat from a flame. "Alpha Blackthorn," Lucian replied with mock courtesy, inclining his head in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and insulting simultaneously. "Still playing protector to strays and lost causes, I see. Though I must admit, this particular lost cause is far more valuable than your usual collection of wounded birds." His gaze shifted to Evelyn, and she felt exposed under the weight of his attention, as if he could see through her skin to the power that pulsed in her veins like liquid fire. When he smiled at her, she understood instinctively that this creature found her terror amusing, that her fear was seasoning for whatever meal he intended to make of her life. "Lady Ashworth," he continued, his voice like silk sliding over steel, "what a pleasure to finally meet the last of the true bloodline. Your reputation precedes you, though I confess the reality is even more intoxicating than the legend suggested." "What do you want?" Evelyn managed to ask, though her voice came out smaller than she intended, betraying the fear that she was trying desperately to hide. The power in her blood was responding to the threat, making her skin feel too tight and her vision sharper than it should be in the darkness. "Want?" Lucian laughed, the sound like breaking crystal in the stillness of the forest. "My dear girl, this isn't about want, this is about necessity. Your bloodline carries the key to barriers that have kept our world separate for millennia. With your power properly channeled, the Shadow Court could finally reclaim what was stolen from us centuries ago." "Over my dead body," Darius snarled, stepping forward until he was nearly touching the edge of the stone circle, his entire frame vibrating with barely contained violence. The amber glow in his eyes had intensified, and Evelyn could see that his fingernails had lengthened into claws that could tear through flesh like paper. "That can certainly be arranged," Lucian replied pleasantly, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her potential death. "Though it would be such a waste. The Alpha bloodline has grown so thin in recent centuries, and you're one of the last pure specimens. Perhaps we could come to some arrangement, her willing cooperation in exchange for your continued existence." The casual way he spoke of trading her life for Darius's made something fierce and protective flare in her chest, burning away the fear that had paralyzed her moments before. These creatures saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used, a weapon to be wielded by whoever was strong enough to claim her. The realization that she had spent her entire life being passed between men who saw her as property rather than a person sent rage coursing through her veins like molten metal. "I'm not a commodity to be traded," she said, stepping up beside Darius, despite his earlier command to stay behind him. The frost that had been forming around her feet began to spread more rapidly, creating delicate patterns on the grass that looked almost like ancient runes. "And I'm certainly not going anywhere with creatures who speak of my willing cooperation while threatening murder." Lucian's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine delight at her defiance, as if her spirit only made her more valuable in his estimation. "There's the fire I was hoping to see," he said, clapping his hands together with the enthusiasm of a child witnessing a particularly entertaining circus act. "How refreshing to meet an Ashworth with backbone. Your ancestors would be so proud." "You knew my ancestors?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, her desperate hunger for information about her heritage overriding her common sense about engaging with obviously dangerous creatures. "Knew them? My dear girl, I helped kill them," Lucian replied with casual cruelty that hit her like a physical blow. "Your great-great-grandmother was particularly spirited. She held out for almost 3 days before the torture broke her will. In the end, she begged us to spare the rest of the bloodline in exchange for sealing away her own power. Noble, really, if ultimately futile. The revelation that her family had been systematically hunted and murdered sent shockwaves through Evelyn's system, but instead of weakening her, the knowledge seemed to awaken something primal and furious in the depths of her soul. The temperature in the clearing plummeted so rapidly that her breath became visible in sharp puffs, and the ancient stones behind her began to hum with an energy that made the very air vibrate with power. "You're making a mistake," Darius said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that Lucian either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "She's not trained, not controlled. If you push her too far, too fast, she could tear a hole between worlds that none of us can close." "Precisely what we're hoping for," Lucian replied with a smile that promised pain and pleasure in equal measure. "The controlled, trained seers of the past were useful, but limited. What we need now is raw power, unfiltered by mortal squeamishness or ethical concerns. Lady Ashworth's emotional state only makes her more valuable to our purposes." His words were like ice water thrown on the fire of her rage, and Evelyn suddenly understood that her anger was exactly what they wanted from her. They weren't trying to break her spirit. They were trying to inflame it, to push her beyond rational thought into the kind of emotional chaos that would make her powers unpredictable and therefore more useful for whatever destructive purposes they had in mind. The realization that she was being manipulated even in her moments of greatest defiance sent a different kind of fury through her system, one that was cold and calculating rather than hot and impulsive. She had spent her entire life being shaped by other people's expectations and agendas, molded into whatever form would be most useful to those around her. Marcus had wanted her docile and ignorant. Darius claimed to want her strong and trained. And now these shadow-court creatures wanted her wild and uncontrolled. "What I want," she said slowly, her voice gaining strength and authority that surprised even her, "is for all of you to stop talking about me as if I'm not standing right here. I'm tired of being everyone's project, everyone's solution to problems I didn't create." The frost around her feet had begun to creep up the ancient stones, creating intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The power in her bloodline was responding to her emotional clarity, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she might actually have some control over what happened next. "What I want," she continued, taking another step forward until she was standing at the very edge of the stone circle, "is to understand exactly what I am and what I'm capable of before I make any decisions about who I trust or where I go." Lucian's smile faltered slightly at her calm tone, as if her unexpected self-possession had disrupted whatever script he had been following. "I'm afraid that's not one of the options available to you, my dear. The power in your blood is too dangerous to leave untrained and too valuable to leave unclaimed. You will come with us, willingly or otherwise." "Otherwise it is, then," Darius said, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. His transformation began so suddenly that Evelyn barely had time to register what was happening before the man beside her was replaced by something far more primal and terrifying. The wolf that emerged from Darius's human form was massive beyond anything that should have been possible, standing nearly as tall as a horse, with fur so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight. His eyes still glowed with that fierce amber light, but now they held an intelligence that was both human and utterly wild. When he bared his teeth, the sound that emerged was less growl than roar, a challenge that echoed through the forest like thunder. But Lucian and his companions didn't seem intimidated by the display of supernatural strength. Instead, they began to change as well, their human facades melting away to reveal something that made Evelyn's blood freeze in her veins. They weren't shapeshifters like Darius. They were something older and far more dangerous, creatures that existed in the spaces between light and shadow, feeding on fear and pain and the life force of those unlucky enough to cross their paths. The battle that erupted around her was unlike anything she could have imagined in her most vivid nightmares. Darius moved with the lethal grace of a born predator, his massive form flowing through the darkness like liquid death. But the shadow creatures were faster and more numerous than she had initially realized. More figures emerged from the tree line with each passing moment until the clearing was filled with writhing darkness and the sounds of supernatural warfare. Evelyn found herself trapped in the center of the stone circle, protected by some ancient ward that kept the combatants at bay, but also prevented her from fleeing into the forest. She could only watch in horror as Darius fought against impossible odds, his powerful form bleeding from dozens of wounds that should have been fatal but somehow failed to slow him down. The shadow creatures attacked in coordinated waves, using their ability to phase in and out of physical form to strike from unexpected angles before vanishing back into the darkness. It was during one of these coordinated attacks that she finally understood what her power was truly meant for. As Lucian materialized directly behind Darius, his claws extended to deliver what would surely be a killing blow, something deep in Evelyn's chest exploded with protective fury. The ancient stones around her flared with light so bright it turned night into day, and energy poured out of her in waves that sent the shadow creatures screaming back into the forest. But the power didn't stop there. It continued, pouring out of her in torrents that she couldn't control, tearing through the barriers between worlds like tissue paper and opening rifts in reality that revealed glimpses of other realms beyond mortal comprehension. She could see the Shadow Court's domain through one of the tiers, a realm of eternal twilight where twisted spires reached toward a moonless sky and creatures that had never known sunlight prowled through streets paved with bones. "Stop!" Darius's voice cut through the chaos, but she couldn't obey even if she wanted to. The power had taken on a life of its own, feeding on her emotions and growing stronger with each passing second. She was dimly aware of Lucian and his remaining followers retreating into the shadows, their earlier confidence replaced by what looked suspiciously like fear. "She's going to tear the veil completely," she heard one of them shout over the roar of supernatural energy. "If she doesn't stop now, every barrier between the realms will collapse." The thought that she might be responsible for unleashing unspeakable horrors on the mortal world should have motivated her to regain control, but the power flowing through her was like trying to redirect a river with her bare hands. She was drowning in her own abilities, being consumed by forces that had been building in her bloodline for generations and were now demanding their due. It was Darius who saved her, not from the shadow creatures but from herself. Even in his wolf form, he managed to force his way through the barriers of energy that surrounded her, his massive frame absorbing punishment that would have killed any normal creature. When he finally reached her, he shifted back to human form and wrapped his arms around her, using his own supernatural nature to ground the wild energy and slowly drain it back into the ancient stones where it belonged. "Focus on my voice," he commanded, his words cutting through the chaos in her mind like a blade through silk. "Feel my heartbeat. Match your breathing to mine. You're not alone in this, Evelyn. Let me help you carry the burden." Slowly, gradually, the torrents of power began to subside as she followed his instructions, using his steady presence as an anchor in the storm of supernatural energy. The rifts between worlds sealed themselves one by one. The shadows retreated back into their proper places, and the ancient clearing returned to its normal state of quiet watchfulness. When the last of the energy finally dissipated, Evelyn collapsed against Darius's chest, her body shaking with exhaustion and the aftershocks of power that had nearly consumed her entirely. She was dimly aware that the shadow creatures had vanished, retreating to whatever dark realm had spawned them, but she knew with cold certainty that this was only the beginning of her troubles. "Are they gone?" she whispered, not daring to lift her head from the solid warmth of his shoulder. "For now," Darius replied, his arms tightening around her in a gesture that felt protective rather than possessive. "But they'll be back, and next time they'll bring more forces. What you did tonight, the power you displayed, it's going to send shockwaves through every supernatural community on the continent." "I don't know how to control it," she admitted, the confession feeling like another kind of defeat. "It just took over. I could have destroyed everything. But you didn't," he said firmly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "When it mattered most, you found a way to stop. That tells me more about your character than a dozen formal tests could reveal." His faith in her felt like both a gift and a burden, adding weight to responsibilities she had never asked for but could no longer deny. The woman who had awakened that morning to find her quiet life in ruins was gone forever, replaced by someone with power that could reshape the world or destroy it entirely. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Now we run," Darius said, helping her to her feet with hands that were surprisingly gentle for someone who had just torn through supernatural enemies like paper. "The Shadow Court isn't the only faction that will be interested in claiming you after tonight's display. We need to reach the sanctuary before word of your awakening spreads any further." "The sanctuary?" "A place where the old bloodlines gathered in times of crisis," he explained, scanning the forest for signs of returning enemies. It's warded against intrusion by any of the major supernatural courts and protected by oaths that predate most of the current power structures. If anywhere can keep you safe while you learn to control your abilities, it's there. The thought of leaving Thornwick forever, of abandoning the last remnants of her mortal life for a world she barely understood, should have terrified her. Instead, as she looked around the clearing where she had nearly torn holes in reality itself, she felt only a strange sense of inevitability. This was who she was meant to be, not the accommodating woman who had shaped herself to fit other people's expectations, but someone with the power to reshape the world according to her own will. "How far is this sanctuary?" she asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. 3 days' journey through the deep forest, Darius replied, his eyes still scanning the shadows for potential threats. "But we'll need to move quickly and stay off the main paths. After tonight, every supernatural creature for 100 miles will be hunting us." The prospect of 3 days alone in the wilderness with a man who was equal parts protector and predator should have set off every alarm bell in her head. But as she looked into his amber eyes and saw genuine concern mixed with something that might have been admiration, she realized that whatever dangers lay ahead, facing them with Darius felt infinitely preferable to facing them alone. "Then we'd better get started," she said, and felt something that had been broken inside her chest begin to heal as she spoke the words. For the first time in months, she was making a choice based on her own desires rather than fear or obligation, and the sense of agency was more intoxicating than any power flowing through her veins. As they gathered what few supplies they could carry and prepared to disappear into the deep forest, Evelyn caught one last glimpse of the stone circle where her old life had finally died. The ancient stones stood silent and watchful in the moonlight, keeping whatever secrets they had witnessed over the centuries, but she no longer felt intimidated by their age and mystery. She was becoming a mystery herself, a power that could not be easily categorized or controlled, and as dangerous as that might be for the world, it felt like the first honest thing she had been in her entire life. Whatever waited for her in the sanctuary, whatever enemies pursued them through the darkness, she would face it all as herself, rather than as someone else's carefully crafted creation. The real question was whether the woman she was becoming would be salvation or destruction for the supernatural world that had claimed her. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, she was finally free. The deep forest was a living cathedral of ancient secrets, its towering trees forming arches that filtered moonlight into silver streams that danced across the moss-covered ground. For 2 days, Evelyn and Darius had traveled through pathways that seemed to exist only when they needed them, following routes that her companion navigated with uncertainty that spoke of centuries of experience in these wild places. Her feet should have been blistered and her body exhausted from the relentless pace, but the power flowing through her veins seemed to sustain her in ways that defied mortal limitations, making her stronger and more resilient with each passing hour. They had barely spoken during their flight, communicating through glances and gestures as they moved through territory where even whispered words might attract unwanted attention from the supernatural predators that hunted in the deepest shadows. But the silence between them was not uncomfortable. Instead, it hummed with an awareness that grew stronger with each shared danger they navigated, each moment when his protective instincts flared in response to threats only his enhanced senses could detect. When he would suddenly freeze and motion for her to hide behind the massive trunk of an ancient oak, she found herself trusting his judgment without question, her own emerging abilities confirming that something dangerous lurked beyond the reach of normal perception. It was on the morning of the 3rd day that everything changed, when they crested a ridge and saw the sanctuary spread out in the valley below like something from a fever dream of paradise and nightmare combined. The structure was impossibly old, its stones covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, and the very air around it shimmered with protective enchantments that made her skin tingle with recognition. Gardens that should have been impossible to maintain in the wild forest flourished around the ancient buildings, their blooms existing in colors that had no names in any mortal language, and creatures that belonged in children's fairy tales grazed peacefully in meadows that defied the laws of nature. "It's beautiful," Evelyn breathed, forgetting for a moment that they were supposed to maintain silence until they reached the sanctuary's protective barriers. "And deadly to those who don't belong here," Darius replied quietly, his eyes scanning the seemingly peaceful scene below for signs of the guardians he knew must be watching their approach. "The sanctuary has stood for over 2,000 years because it doesn't tolerate visitors who come with ill intent or impure motives." As they descended into the valley, following a path that seemed to appear beneath their feet with each step, Evelyn became aware of being evaluated by intelligence that felt vast and ancient, beyond human comprehension. The sensation was not threatening exactly, but it was thorough in a way that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable, as if every secret she had ever kept was being catalogued and assessed by entities that existed beyond the normal constraints of physical form. The first guardian they encountered was also the most unsettling, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, but whose eyes held the weight of millennia, dressed in robes that seemed to be woven from starlight and shadow in equal measure. She emerged from what had appeared to be empty air, stepping into their path with movements that suggested she existed slightly outside the normal flow of time and space. "Darius Blackthorne," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears shouldn't be able to detect. "It has been 47 years since you last sought sanctuary within our borders. The Council still debates whether your previous visit ended in success or catastrophe." "Lady Seraphina," Darius replied with a formal bow that somehow managed to convey both respect and barely contained impatience. "I bring the last of the Ashworth bloodline, awakened and in desperate need of training before her power destroys what remains of the barriers between worlds." The ancient woman's attention shifted to Evelyn, and under that timeless gaze she felt like a butterfly pinned to a collector's board, every detail of her existence being catalogued and measured against standards she couldn't hope to understand. When Seraphina smiled, it was with the benevolent cruelty of a teacher who already knew exactly how difficult the lessons ahead would be. "Evelyn Ashworth," she said, and hearing her name spoken by this creature sent chills racing down her spine. "Your bloodline's return was prophesied long ago, though the seers who spoke of it disagreed about whether your awakening would herald salvation or apocalypse for our kind. I'm tired of being everyone's prophecy," Evelyn said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I just want to understand what I am and how to control what's happening to me." Seraphina's laugh was like silver bells ringing in a crystal cathedral, beautiful and somehow ominous at the same time. "Control is an illusion, child. What you need to learn is harmony, how to dance with powers that are older than civilization itself, how to channel forces that could reshape reality according to your will." The casual way she spoke of reshaping reality should have been terrifying, but instead it sent a thrill of anticipation through Evelyn's system. For too long, she had been powerless, shaped by other people's choices and desires, but now she was being offered the chance to become someone who could actively change the world rather than merely react to it. "How long will the training take?" Darius asked, and something in his tone suggested that time was a luxury they couldn't afford to waste. "As long as it takes," Seraphina replied with maddening vagueness. Power like hers cannot be rushed or forced into convenient schedules. The last Ashworth seer spent 30 years here, learning to master abilities far less potent than what flows through this one's veins. "We don't have 30 years," Darius said grimly. The Shadow Court knows what she's capable of now, and they won't give up their pursuit just because she's taken sanctuary here. Sooner or later, they'll find a way to breach your defenses or wait for her to emerge. Then, perhaps, Serafina said with a smile that promised either salvation or damnation, it's time for a more intensive approach to her education. The training that followed was unlike anything Evelyn could have imagined in her wildest dreams or worst nightmares. Serafina and the other guardians of the sanctuary possessed teaching methods that bypassed normal learning entirely, downloading centuries of accumulated knowledge directly into her consciousness through mystical means that left her reeling with information she hadn't possessed moments before. She learned that her bloodline was indeed the key to barriers between worlds, but not in the way the Shadow Court believed. Rather than being a weapon to tear down the ancient protections, the Ashworth Seers had originally been their creators and guardians. The knowledge came with a crushing weight of responsibility that made her previous concerns seem trivial by comparison. Every supernatural creature that existed in the modern world did so because her ancestors had woven spells to keep the truly dangerous entities locked away in realms where they couldn't threaten mortal civilization. The barriers had been weakening for generations as the bloodline grew thin and scattered, and her awakening was less a random occurrence than a desperate response by forces beyond mortal comprehension to the growing threat of complete dimensional collapse. The Shadow Court wants to use your power to shatter what remains of the barriers, Serafina explained during one of their sessions in the sanctuary's heart, a chamber carved from a single massive crystal that amplified psychic energies beyond normal limits. They believe that releasing the old ones will restore the supernatural world to its former dominance over mortal realm. But they fail to understand that those ancient entities care nothing for the distinctions between supernatural and human. They would devour everything equally. The revelation that she was essentially the last line of defense between reality and cosmic horrors that made the Shadow Court look benevolent by comparison should have broken her spirit entirely. Instead, it awakened something fierce and protective in her chest, a determination to prove worthy of the legacy that had been passed down through generations of strong women who had sacrificed everything to keep the world safe. But the training came with costs that grew steeper with each passing day. The more she learned to channel her abilities, the more she could feel herself changing in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Her perception of time began to shift, making conversations with normal beings feel frustratingly slow and limited. Her emotional responses became more intense, but also more detached, as if she was experiencing feelings through layers of cosmic perspective that made individual concerns seem insignificant. Most troubling of all, she began to sense the presence of the entities her ancestors had locked away, their alien intelligence pressing against the barriers with patient malevolence that promised eventual escape. It was during the second week of training that she finally understood why Marcus had been so terrified of her awakening. She was sitting in the crystal chamber, practicing the delicate art of weaving reality itself into new configurations, when she felt his presence approaching the sanctuary's borders. The protective enchantments that surrounded the ancient refuge could keep out enemies and casual visitors, but they couldn't bar someone who had once been bonded to her on a level that transcended the merely physical. "He's here," she told Darius that evening as they walked through gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors under stars that seemed closer than they should. "I can feel him getting closer, and he's different than he was before." "Different how?" Darius asked, his entire body going alert in the way that meant he was preparing for potential violence. "Stronger," she said, struggling to put the sensation into words that made sense, "but also diminished somehow, as if he's gained power by sacrificing parts of himself that he can never get back." What she didn't tell him was that she could also sense Marcus's emotions through their severed bond, and the overwhelming feeling she detected was not the regret or guilt she might have expected, but rather a desperate hunger that made her skin crawl with recognition. Whatever he had done to himself in the months since abandoning her, it had left him with a need that only she could satisfy, and he was coming to claim what he believed belonged to him by right of their shared past. The confrontation came 3 nights later under a blood moon that turned the sanctuary's protective barriers visible as sheets of silver fire that danced between the ancient trees. Marcus appeared at the edge of the consecrated ground, looking like a nightmare version of the man she had once loved. His familiar features sharpened to inhuman perfection, his eyes burning with hunger that went beyond physical desire into something that threatened to consume everything it touched. "Evelyn!" he called across the barrier, his voice carrying harmonics that bypassed her rational mind and spoke directly to the part of her that had loved him for 10 years. "I've come to bring you home, to show you what we could become together if you stop fighting your true nature." "My true nature," she replied, stepping forward until she stood just inside the sanctuary's protective boundary. "You mean the nature you lied about for a decade? The heritage you helped hide from me while pretending to love me?" "I did love you," Marcus said, and the sincerity in his voice was more painful than any lie could have been. "But I was also terrified of what you might become if your power awakened uncontrolled. I thought if I could keep you happy and ignorant, we could have a normal life together." "There's nothing normal about building a relationship on deception," she said. But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the pull of their old connection trying to draw her back into patterns of thought and feeling that belonged to the woman she used to be. "Look what embracing your power has cost you," Marcus continued, gesturing toward the sanctuary around them. "You're trapped here like a beautiful bird in a cage, surrounded by creatures who see you as a tool to be used for their own purposes. Come with me and I'll show you how to use your abilities for something that actually matters. For us, for the love we shared, for the future we could still have together." The temptation in his words was more dangerous than any physical threat, because part of her remembered the simple happiness of their life together before the complications of supernatural politics had torn them apart. But as she looked into his transformed eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold, the same hungry possessiveness that she had glimpsed in Lucian's gaze, the desire to own and control, rather than to love and cherish. "What did you do to yourself, Marcus?" she asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand what he had become. "I made myself worthy of you," he replied, his smile revealing teeth that were too sharp and too white. "I sought out the power necessary to protect and guide you, to become the partner you deserved, rather than the weak mortal who could only watch from the sidelines." "You made a deal with the Shadow Court," Darius said, emerging from the shadows with his own eyes glowing amber with suppressed fury. "You let them corrupt you in exchange for enhanced abilities, thinking it would give you the strength to reclaim her." Marcus's facade of loving concern cracked slightly, revealing the predator that lurked beneath his transformed exterior. "At least I didn't abandon her to face her awakening alone," he snarled. "Where were you when she needed protection, Alpha? Too busy playing politics with the Council to care about one confused mortal?" "I came as soon as I sensed her power manifesting," Darius replied with deadly calm, "which is more than can be said for the Keeper who was supposed to be watching over her." The two men faced each other across the sanctuary's barrier like wolves preparing for battle, their supernatural natures making the very air crackle with tension and potential violence. But it was Evelyn who stepped between them, her own power flaring in response to the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made both men step back in shock. "I'm tired of being the prize in other people's contests. Marcus, you destroyed what we had the moment you chose deception over trust. And Darius, whatever protection you're offering comes with its own chains and expectations. The power flowing through her had reached levels that made the sanctuary's ancient stones sing in harmony with her emotions, and she could feel Seraphina and the other guardians watching from the shadows, ready to intervene if her abilities threatened the refuge's stability. But for the first time since her awakening began, she felt completely in control of the forces that coursed through her veins. "I choose myself," she continued, her words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I choose to learn what I'm capable of, to explore the legacy my ancestors left me, and to decide for myself how that power should be used. Not as anyone's weapon or tool or prize, but as a free woman making her own choices." The declaration sent shockwaves through both men, but it was Marcus who recovered first, his transformed features twisting with rage that revealed how little of the man she had loved remained beneath his supernatural modifications. "You think you can dismiss what we shared so easily?" he snarled. "You think your precious sanctuary can protect you from the consequences of rejecting your true destiny?" "My true destiny," Evelyn replied with a smile that held no warmth, "is whatever I decide to make it." With that, she reached out and touched the sanctuary's barrier, not to disable it, but to reinforce it, weaving her own power into the ancient protections until they blazed with silver fire that would burn any creature foolish enough to test their strength. Marcus recoiled from the display, his borrowed power no match for the raw potential that flowed through her bloodline. "This isn't over," he warned, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a threat from someone who had already lost the war. "The Shadow Court won't give up just because you've hidden yourself away in this place. They'll find other ways to claim what belongs to them." "Then I'll be ready for them," Evelyn said simply. "But I'll face them as myself, not as anyone's keeper or captive or creation." As Marcus disappeared back into the forest, his retreating figure already beginning to blur at the edges as his supernatural modifications pulled him back toward whatever dark realm had empowered him, Evelyn felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, she had chosen her own path without considering what others might want or expect from her, and the sensation was more intoxicating than any power flowing through her veins. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Darius said quietly, moving to stand beside her as they watched the last traces of Marcus's presence fade into the night. "Probably both," she admitted, surprising herself by laughing at the admission. "But it felt honest in a way that nothing else has since this all began." "And now?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew what her answer would be. "Now I learn everything the sanctuary can teach me," she said, turning to face him with eyes that blazed with determination and newfound purpose. "I master every aspect of my heritage, explore every possibility my bloodline offers, and prepare for whatever challenges await me in the world beyond these borders." "And after that?" Evelyn smiled, feeling power and possibility singing through her veins like music made of starlight and storm clouds. "After that, I remake the world according to my own vision of what it should be, starting with ensuring that no other woman ever has to choose between love and freedom, between safety and authenticity, between being herself and being what others need her to be." As they walked back toward the sanctuary's heart, where Seraphina and the other guardians waited to continue her education in arts older than civilization itself, Evelyn felt the last traces of the broken, accommodating woman she used to be finally disappear into memory. In her place stood someone who would reshape reality itself, rather than allow others to dictate the terms of her existence. Someone who would use the power in her blood to protect not just the barriers between worlds, but the right of every soul to choose their own destiny. The woman who had awakened months ago to find her quiet life destroyed by a letter was gone forever, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more free. The supernatural world had sought to claim her as a weapon or a prize, but what they had created instead was a force of nature that would rewrite the rules they had taken for granted for millennia. And as the blood moon set over the sanctuary's ancient spires, casting everything in silver shadows that danced with promise and possibility, Evelyn Ashworth finally understood what it meant to be truly, completely, authentically herself.